But we thought it might be a good time to have a conversation about Bushism versus Reaganism on the Laura Ingraham Show, kind of a year-end retrospective. Which philosophy is rising, which is falling, which is popular, which is less so? And we thought bringing on Jon Meacham, who, of course, is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. His latest bestseller, a wonderful biography of George H.W. Bush, Destiny and Power, the American Odyssey of George Herbert Walker Bush, just released last month. And, of course, Craig Shirley's bestseller on Reagan, called The Last Act. I always add a the. It's called Last Act. Why do I always say The Last Act? I don't know.
No modifier.
I don't know what that means about me, but The Last Act, Final Years, an emerging legacy of Ronald Reagan, also out just recently. Both fabulous books. Gentlemen, great to talk to you, and Merry Christmas to you both.
Merry Christmas, Laura.
Happy Advent.
Happy Advent, third week.
Be precise.
John always is the stickler for the details because we're still on the third candle of Advent until Sunday, and then the fourth candle will be lit. Let's start with you, John. The sense here among, I think, the conservative base is that we are seeing the end of Bushism. We are seeing the decline of the Bush clout in the Republican Party, despite their money, despite their connections, despite all the wealth, and a rise of a more populist, perhaps Reagan-esque philosophy. What is your sense, given the landscape out there?
I think that's right. I think that, in fact, the movement conservatism is the overarching narrative, really, of the last 40, even 50 years. And to some extent, Bushism was the exception to the rule, even in real time. For George H.W. Bush to have, as Craig knows more about this, has forgotten more about this than most people know, Bush going on the ticket in 1980 was a nod to the fact that there was still a moderate conservative Eisenhower element in the party. And 1988, George H.W. Bush had to fight so hard to get there. But then once the tax pledge was broken in 90, the right, which was where the center of gravity in the party was, said, see, we told you, he was never really one of us. So I think the reassertion of movement conservatism is unquestionably the story of 2016.
Craig, we have been speaking about the divide between the rank-and-file Republicans since about really 2006, when George W. Bush picked Harriet Miers for the Supreme Court. That was the first real break that conservatives had. And I'm not trying to toot my own horn here, but inject myself. But I was leading that fight, having clerked for Justice Thomas and understanding kind of what we needed at the court. And then that was the beginning of, I think, the revolt against what more big government, American greatness, republicanism, conservatism was all about.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know if it's fair to say, if I agree entirely that Reaganism is dominant now, and the evidence is clear. First of all, you had Lindsey Graham at the debate the other night pining for the days of George Bush. Then you have the Paul Ryan budget, which is more Bush-like than Reagan-like. I think the struggle is going to go on for a long time, and this is a struggle that actually predates Reagan and Bush. It goes back to Eisenhower and Taft, and the party has operated as more or less in a state of equilibrium since 1952. But sometimes Reaganism is more dominant, sometimes Bushism is more dominant. But I refuse to say that Bushism has ended as a force inside the Republican Party, because I think the evidence is pretty clear that it's still there and very potent. Just by the mere fact that Jeb Bush is running and thinks he can get the nomination.
There have been moments in the campaign where I think just regular people don't focus on politics as carefully as either of you do. Watch the campaign, they think, oh, is this someone who could be like Reagan? I mean, no one's going to be the next Reagan. Reagan was Reagan, but and they see these flashpoints on the campaign trail. Let's listen.
Everywhere I go, I have crowds like this. Everywhere. We have the biggest crowds by far. Because there's a movement going on, folks. This isn't just like, let's go and have a good time. We have a message, and the message is we don't want to let other people take advantage of us.
He went on to say, we need a big movement. We need a movement of turnout in this election to run the table. He said, we want to run the table in this election. Reagan wasn't going to be out there bragging about his poll numbers. Reagan was creating a movement with his ideological framework that he laid out. Trump really doesn't lay out the framework so much, but he has the broad strokes of the need to return to a greatness ideal. John, you can comment on that.
Yeah, maybe I'm just too sentimental about President Reagan, but I resist those parallels with Trump. I mean, Reagan spent more than a decade working out his ideas about politics on those trains when he wouldn't fly for GE. Two-term governor of California, ran for president 3 times. We're at a point where experience and establishment are kind of blended together. It seems to me in the popular conversation anyway. And so, Trump is unquestionably mining a deep vein of unease right now in the country. But I think President Reagan was another thing altogether.
Craig, I want to play a soundbite from Ted Cruz, on the other hand, who set up a moment in the last debate, which has expanded into a larger conversation. He's going to come on in just a few moments, about a time for choosing, which of course is the title of one of Reagan's iconic speeches. Let's listen.
There was a time for choosing, as Reagan put it, where there was a battle over amnesty, and some chose, like Senator Rubio, to stand with Barack Obama and Chuck Schumer and support a massive amnesty plan. Others chose to stand with Jeff Sessions and Steve King and the American people and secure the border.
And he went on to say that was the opposition. And then they proceeded to pick apart with, his views on legal immigration and so forth. But he invoked a time for choosing. Trump's invoking "Make America Great Again," which is, of course, is another line of Ronald Reagan's. Right. Talk about that symbolism.
Well, I mean, obviously, Reagan is enduring. I will say that Ted Cruz, I mean, it was good to see him invoke Reagan. That was, of course, the 64 speech for Goldwater, although it was also known as Rendezvous with Destiny, which I prefer because that's the title of one of my books.
Oh, of course, that's right. I forgot, Craig.
But a time for choosing had little to do with immigration. It was much more philosophical. And I agree with John, too, is that Reagan was a fully formed American intellectual conservative by 1980. And we associate Reagan now with a kind of a cult of personality and kind of downplay the idea, except for us, 3 of us. But the ideology is somewhat downplayed, and it's more about his persona. Whereas Trump now is running more on his persona, but Reagan in 1980 was running more on his conservatism. And there was less persona attached to him. He always had his following, going back to Hollywood and radio and movies and governor and being a leader of the conservative movement. But beyond the conservative movement, it was more his appeal of intellectual populist conservatism that brought people to him more than it was his persona.
Hey, John, do you think part of what's going on here with Trump's appeal? We know the anger, the frustration, the showmanship is part of politics. Let's face it. People want to have fun when they go to a political rally. They don't want it to be all doom and gloom. They want to have fun. To some extent, they want to feel good about themselves again. And they want to have their values reflected. But versus Reagan, where Reagan really hung a lot of ornaments on the tree. He really decorated the tree of conservatism with deep substance. Is today's short attention span and the way we consume information so much different than it was then?
I think there's a lot to that. I think there was a travel log I read back when I was writing about Andrew Jackson, of a Scottish traveler who said that in America, political movements were built more on the apostle than they were the creed, which is an interesting way of thinking about it. Trump also, like any institution, the country tends to overcorrect. So parishes call leaders, and they'll have a quiet guy, and then they'll think they need someone more charismatic, and then they'll get tired of the charismatic fellow, so the next one will be quiet. University presidents are like this, and presidents are like this. There's this enormous frustration with Obama's emotional distance from the concerns and cares of the country.
John, we're going to take a break. Hold that thought. John Meacham and Craig Shirley will stay with us. Continue this conversation. Reaganism versus Bushism. Which is more dominant? Which is on the rise? And also, Ted Cruz. Don't go.
I love my dad. In fact, my dad is the greatest man alive. And if anybody disagrees, we'll go outside. Unless you're like 6'5" and 250 and much younger than me, then we'll negotiate. I'm still not going to change my mind for sure. And I love my brother, and I think he's been a great president. It doesn't bother me a bit to be proud of them and love them, but I know for a fact that if I'm going to be successful going beyond the consideration, that I'm going to have to do it on my own.
If you come walking in.
Well, how did that all work out? It could still work out for Jeb. I mean, things could change. I mean, I guess. I mean, all the establishment could all come back to the understanding that you have to stick with the people who brought you to the dance. And for them, the Bushes brought them to the dance. You're going to go with Marco Rubio? They were talking about that on Morning Joe this morning. Joe Scarborough's come along to the understanding that Marco Rubio might be slightly in over his head. Joining us, continuing with us, Jon Meacham. Of course, how many biographies have you written now, John? I've even lost track.
Oh, God.
How many?
Yeah, so have I.
Do you even know how many? That's really bad when you don't even remember your own.
4.5 if you count. I did a book about the friendship between Roosevelt and Churchill, so that's a 4.5.
A long email doesn't count as a book, by the way. So don't try to pull that game on me. Of course, Andrew, and you go to Barnes and Noble. There's Craig's books. Craig has a wall of books on Reagan, right, in 1941. Also, we have a wall of books, and Meacham has a wall of books. There's like O'Reilly, Meacham, Shirley. There's these brands that you just are just all over Barnes and Noble, and you can just capture all of it at one time in one shopping trip. So it's great to have you both on. Of course, John's book, Destiny and Power, just came out on H.W. Bush, and Craig's book, Last Act, on Reagan. It's his third in his Reagan series. Gentlemen, you heard the old Jeb bite. He was trying early on to assure people that he was not going to be a carbon copy of his brother, and it was going to be different. But he never really explained how it was going to be different. That, I think, was going to be a real stumbling block, and still is a stumbling block for Jeb, because despite the fact that most in the establishment don't realize this, most conservatives think, George Bush is a wonderful person, but they really screwed things up in the Republican Party. And John, I'll let you comment on that, and Craig, I want you to get your view.
Well, I think that Jeb is, a different figure, and has not articulated the clear enough rationale for him. To some extent, if this were about the family, it might be, at least it would be a clearer choice, and he would be perhaps a stronger, more vivid candidate at the moment. All three of these guys, the 41, 43, and Jeb are very different people. I mean, one of the things about the father against the son is they came out of very different parts of the party. And I take your point about the unconservative elements of the George W. Bush years, but at least looking at 2000, Bush was running more as a Reagan conservative than a George H.W. Bush conservative.
Oh, he started out by saying humble foreign policy. It was going to be a humble foreign policy. We're going to do all these conservative things. Then 9/11 happened, and we did a lot of things. Yeah. We did a lot of things. Craig, Bushism versus Reaganism is the conversation. In my mind, the growth of government, as we see in this omnibus spending bill, $66 billion, I think confirms what the establishment really is all about. It's growing power in Washington, cutting deals behind closed doors, regardless of the effect of the next generation and what they're going to have to pay back.
Well, let me say, as an historian, I find the budget interesting. As a conservative, I'm appalled. Is that there's really nothing in there for conservatives whatsoever. It grows government, it grows Planned Parenthood funding, just on and on and on and on and on. There's nothing whatsoever. But I do think that what's interesting is that Jeb is kind of a Shakespearean victim, tragic victim of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was a very good governor of Florida. He governed as a conservative. I think he started out life more conservative than his father or even his brother, but times have changed, and even though the Bushes are probably held in high regard by the Republican Party, it's more appreciation of their personality or their being at the right place at the right time, but not necessarily an embrace of their policies. And Jeb is unfortunately feeling the effect of that.
Well, I think the number one issue, without a doubt, that has driven Trump is the same issue that has been a major stumbling block for the Bushes, which is immigration. So it drives Trump more than anything else, people are very concerned about illegal immigration for national security, wages reasons, cultural changes. It makes them afraid and angry because they think it's not fair. Goes to general fairness. And we obviously saw, his brother push for this immigration reform back in 2007, which caused a huge revolt in the party. And John, going back to you, I've said this to my establishment friends for years. Why not just compromise with conservatives on some issues? Just do a little bit. I mean, a little step forward. I mean, there is a break, and I guess the party will just blow up, and that probably is what's going to happen ultimately. It's going to need to happen. But if you want to keep the party together and keep the establishment in charge, then you're going to have to do a little something for the people.
Yeah, you guys pay a little bit of tribute, pay a little bit of a ransom. That's true.
A little something.
And that's what got George H.W. Bush in trouble way back when. It seems like way back when, now a quarter century ago.
Right.
He gave him read my lips, and then he broke it. But I will say, let's be just for the record, the deal that Bush got in 1990 that was so controversial would have kept the current bill from happening, because he did get spending constraints in exchange for the tax increases. So he was more fiscally responsible than the current crew.
No, I agree. I completely agree on that.
Faint praise. But he did believe that was a ransom worth paying. And as Bill Clinton will tell you at length, which is redundant, I know, that really helped set up the surpluses of the 90s.
And when we go back and we look at either the budget surpluses of Clinton, as you said, or the constraining government growth under Reagan, to the extent he could do that while funding the military, these same fault lines of Reagan versus Bush, voodoo economics, these same fault lines really exist today, and they haven't gone away. They were papered over for a time when we needed to defeat the Soviets. They were papered over for a time when we wanted to defeat Al Gore. But those fault lines, Craig, and I'll let you close it out because Cruz is waiting for us, those same fault lines exist today.
Yes, and it's a struggle that's probably going to continue for a long time. Let me just say one thing is that everybody forgets about Graham Rudman, but back in 1990, the automatic spending cuts had actually kicked in, and Bush's numbers were rising, and then he stepped in and countermanded Graham Rudman and came up with his own budget deal, which included raising taxes, which is what cost him re-election. But ironically, if he had let Graham Rudman do its work, then he probably would have won re-election in 1992.
No one would have this conversation on the radio today. This was a phenomenal discussion. Jon Meacham, we love having you on. Thank you so much. Destiny and Power is a great book as a Christmas gift, hostess gift. Same with Last Act, Final Years, Emerging Legacy of Ronald Reagan. Craig Shirley's wonderful new book. Thank you both, gentlemen. Have a very, very Merry Christmas. Come back in the new year.
You too, Laura. Thank you.